As many of you are no doubt aware, there's a war going on in a small subsection of the video game community. It's a war that's been raging for over a decade now with no end to the fighting in sight. Of course, the war I speak of is the Great Localization War. On one side, you have the White Knights who will defend to the death a localizer's right to creative freedom, and on the other, you have those that have seen the light of faithful localization on a holy crusade to eliminate arbitrary change and censorship from video game localization. If you've seen any of my other localization videos, you'll no doubt know that I am a proud member of the latter. Now, I'm not here to widen the gap that separates the two camps of localization. If anything, I'd like to try to shrink it by giving those on the other side of the debate my perspectives on defending what I'd call over-localization or localization change that goes beyond what is absolutely necessary. So, where do we begin? Well, I like to start off by talking about what I believe to be the most common reason someone might defend a game's localization that has clearly gone too far. And that reason is that they enjoyed the game in localized form. Let's say, for example, you're a huge fan of the Xenoblade series and you loved every minute of the time you spent playing its games. When you see someone saying that the localization of those games is actual garbage, you're going to get mad and defensive because you really enjoyed the Xenoblade games. It's only natural to defend something you like, so to you, you're in the right without a doubt. However, in my opinion, this defensive response comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what's being criticized here. I know that for me, and I'd hope many others who criticize localization, we are in no way criticizing the actual game whose localization we're talking about. We're only criticizing the localization team and their decisions made during the localization process, as well as anyone else who might have influenced these decisions, like company executives and marketing departments. When I criticize a game's localization, it is completely, or at the very least mostly independent from my enjoyment of said game as a finished product. I can absolutely hate the way a game is localized, but still have a great time playing it. Pokemon Red, for example, a game whose terrible localization I am all too familiar with, is still one of my favorite games even though I very harshly criticize its localization. So, next time you see someone criticizing the localization of a game you like, don't take it personally. We're not criticizing the game, we're just criticizing its localization, which should be treated as completely separate from the game itself. You could also flip this to the other side, meaning that when you defend a game's localization, you're not defending the actual game, you're defending the localizers and other people we talked about who didn't have anything to do with the creative process of actually making the game you like. This actually leads really well into another point I'd like to make about why you shouldn't defend bad localization. Like we just established, the localization of a game and the actual game itself are completely separate beasts. Many times, localization isn't even done in-house at a regional branch of a company and is instead outsourced to random people who actually, in every sense, had absolutely nothing to do with the creation of the game they're localizing. But even if the localization is done in-house, the localizers still have nothing to do with the creative process of making a game. Now, I don't know about you, but when I buy a game, I buy it because I want to play the game the actual developers created, not the game some random localizers and regional branch office marketing teams think I want to play. This is probably the biggest reason I get so heated when I see arbitrary changes made to a script of a game or series I love. Let me give you an example. I hate to use Pokemon again, but it's probably the most relevant example for me, seeing as I've played every mainline game since the original Red and Blue, and the series has been such a big part of my life for over 2 decades. So, as a kid, I loved Pokemon. It was without a doubt one of, if not my absolute favorite game series for many years. But when I was a kid, obviously I did not speak Japanese. My first language is English, so the games I played were also English. However, as I grew up and started to learn more and more about Japanese and do more and more research into the Pokemon games, I came to the realization that what I'd been playing for all those years wasn't actually Pokemon. It was a version of Pokemon that the English localizers wanted me to play. Understandably, upon finding this out, I felt a bit duped. I had been putting my trust in these localizers for years, and at pretty much every turn they had betrayed that trust. And this was the case with pretty much every other Japanese series that I grew up with, so hopefully you can see why I've become a bit jaded when it comes to localization. In my experience, and hopefully some other Japanese speakers and learners can back me up on this, the more I learned about Japanese, the less I trusted the localizations I read to be accurate, especially when it comes to games. That's why now I always play games in the original Japanese if it's available to me. I'm just not interested in a localizer's interpretation of the work done by the actual developers I like. It's that simple. But where does this leave someone who doesn't speak Japanese, because that's a large portion of the English-speaking world? Well, as far as I see it, you have 3 options. Number 1, you can learn learn Japanese. There's been a rise in people learning Japanese just so they can enjoy Japanese media in recent years, and I think that's great. However, learning a second language takes years, in some cases decades, so it's understandable that not everyone would want to go down that path. For those people, I'd say number 2 is the best option, and that is to continue being outspoken about wanting faithful localization. It's very slight, but there has been a shift towards more accurate localization recently, and in my opinion this is largely due to the outcry from people that want faithful localization because they prefer to play what the developers actually made. The third option is obviously the worst, and that is to just continue playing games with bad localization. This will allow arbitrary change and censorship during localization to remain the status quo, which I'd like to believe is not what we want as a community. So, if you see convincing proof that a game's localization has gone too far, please try to avoid it. Voting with your wallet is the best way to let companies know you want change. But at the end of the day, it shouldn't be the consumer's job to make localizers change. It's their responsibility to do their jobs the right way. But what is the right way? How do we determine that a game's localization is done quote-unquote correctly? Well, at a very basic level, almost every source will tell you that the job of a video game localizer is to take a game and adapt it to better suit a specific target audience. However, anything beyond that basic definition will be up to the company employing the localizers as well as the individual localizers themselves. What this means is that the level to which a game is adapted and changed will depend on who is localizing it as well as who they're working for. This wild west of sorts has caused the acceptable level of video game localization to fly out of whack and settle in an area where localizers benefit more from their localizations than consumers do. For example, if a localizer is allowed to make a bunch of creative and opinionated changes to a game, and then that game sells well, that localizer can say that that game's success was at least due in part to their localization. This will cause other game companies wishing to have their games sell well in that localizer's home country to seek them out over other localizers with worse results. Now, of course, this isn't always the case, and this example really simplifies many aspects of localization, but it's just meant as an example of why localizers would be inclined to lean towards the side of creative liberty if there is no regulated industry standard for the level of localization in the video game industry. When it comes to a person's job and livelihood, one will typically act in their own personal interest, which is another reason we can never truly trust localizers when they say they're doing their jobs the right way. In my opinion, the best way to localize a game would be to only make changes that are absolutely 100% necessary in order for the game to be understood by the target audience. For a typical big-budget Japanese video game like one from Nintendo or Square Enix, that would mean only changing things like honorifics and language-specific puns and jokes. The general rule of thumb should be that if something, when unchanged, could be understood by your audience, then it should be left alone. A localizer's job is not to remake a game, it's to make a game understandable to the target audience. Games that developers put thousands upon thousands of hours into making don't need your help to stand on their own 2 feet around the world, especially nowadays when people are more globally minded than ever. Just to prove this point, let's play a little game. Let's say I put 2 versions of the same game in front of you and ask you to choose one. The one on the left is a version of the game where the localizers tried to stay as close as possible to the intentions of the original developers, so you know what you're playing is the actual intended experience, while the one on the right is a version of the game where the localizers had much more freedom, meaning the game is very far from the original intentions of the developers, and as an English speaker, you'll have no idea what has been changed and what hasn't. Which version would you go for? I'd like to hope that most people would go for the left version. I know I would. To put it another way, by defending the localization practices that lead to the creation of games like the right version, you're depriving yourself and others of a more authentic experience. We need to stop allowing these practices to become more and more normalized in the industry before it's too late and many of the foreign games we love are marred beyond recognition by localization. And the first step to stopping these practices is to stop defending them. Even if you don't want to jump sides and start preaching the good word of faithful localization, at the very least, just stop defending bad localization, because you're doing yourself and the whole gaming industry a disservice. But anyway, that's everything I wanted to mention about the long-running localization debate in this video. I hope I at least gave you guys something to think about. If there's anyone else from either side of the issue that would like to maybe bring up something I forgot to mention, by all means leave a comment so we can get some other perspectives on things. Other than that, you guys know the drill. If you happen to enjoy today's video, consider giving it a like. It's always greatly appreciated and helps me out a ton. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, consider subscribing as well. Thanks as always for watching, everybody, and I'll see you in the next one. Ack out.